Welcome back. So coming up, does the Prime Minister have a woman problem? But first, would Winston Churchill want his financial legacy spent on a migration museum? It's time now for the head-to-head. Yes, that's right. Winston Churchill's financial legacy has been used to spread pro-immigration messaging. So after the wartime leader's death in 1965, the Churchill Fellowship was set up with public donations. The fund has recently been used to expand the work of the Migration Museum. The museum supports a vision of a world where everyone is free to move, and has plans to expand to schools and even run training sessions for civil servants on migration history and learning and DEI programmes. Well, critics have branded the museum a taxpayer-funded propaganda outfit. The Churchill Fellowship has donated more than 40 grand to this museum. That is, of course, despite Winston Churchill's warning in 1954 that immigration could create racial tensions within the UK. So tonight I'm asking, would Winston Churchill want his financial legacy spent on an immigration museum? Well, going head-to-head on this now, political advisor Pablo O'Hana and historian and broadcaster David Oldroyd-Bolt. Thank you very much. David, I'll start with you. Is this actually really offensive to Winston Churchill?
I don't think it's offensive. I think it's historically illiterate. Churchill was, aside from being the greatest statesman of the 20th century, one of the finest historians of the 20th century. And any museum that looks at the history of migration in Britain should do so honestly, rather than trying to concoct this idea that Britain is a nation of immigrants. It is not. The population of Britain was remarkably steady from the arrival in the 5th and 6th centuries of the Anglos, the Jutes and the Saxons until the early 21st century. We were one of the most stable nations in history in the makeup of our population and in its demographics. So if there were to be a migration museum that wanted to tell the true story of migration to Britain until the explosion under Tony Blair, guided by Barbara Roche, who is the head of the Migration Museum, then I think Winston Churchill would have been delighted by that as a man who believed in history and believed in the power of education. But for this, as I say, concocted narrative, one that bears very little relation to true history, and that seems to be, as was reported in the head of the segment, a propagandistic exercise using not only the Churchill Fellowship money, but £1.3 million of Arts Council money to expand what is, by the museum's own admission, a little visited museum in a car park in Lewisham to a prime site in the centre of the City of London, and then to every school in the country is, I think, wrong. I'll come
back to you. Paolo, I mean, look, don't you think that Winston Churchill would be turning in his grave if he thought that his legacy money was being used to teach civil servants about open borders and DEI programmes and then indoctrinate kids at school with it? I mean, by the way, those are probably still the same group of civil servants and school kids that think he was the most evil man in history.
I think Churchill's actions speak louder than sort of cherry-picked quotes. He blocked Britain's first anti-immigration law and he opened our arms to desperate refugees. He saw newcomers as moral allies and strategic assets. He was actually what we need now, a migration pragmatist, not a sort of hardline restrictionist reactionary. And I think probably most people, we would agree that Churchill is probably our greatest ever prime minister, precisely because he knew, understood and encouraged what makes our country the greatest in the world, and that is its diversity, its tolerance and its compassion. And at the root of that, it's who we are. It's why we were right to open our doors to those fleeing Nazi Germany in 1939, and it's why we're right to open our doors fleeing Putin's Russia today. Churchill knew that then, and real patriots know that now. That's fundamentally what our country is. It is a nation of immigrants and migrants. We are diverse and tolerant. It's what makes us who we are and why we're so great.
OK, David, look, I wonder whether or not this is exactly why the charity sector is such a scam, really. You can get a job at the Churchill Fellowship, which most people would think would make you, you know, a fan of Winston Churchill, maybe someone who's a true patriotic Brit, all of this stuff. And actually, it looks like you've been completely and utterly infested by DEI stuff.
I think it's yet another instance of the third sector mugging off the public who pay their bills and essentially saying, we don't care what you think, we don't care whether this is in concordance with the original foundational ethos of the charity, in this instance, to promote the work and the study of Churchill and his legacy. They don't care, they are unaccountable, and they will continue to push these highly politicised, historically incorrect ideas until they are brought under control, which means either being held to account on the basis of their foundation, and where they are found to have transgressed that, to be penalised financially or legally, or simply to be defunded from any public funding whatsoever. And I would like to know whether the Churchill Fellowship is conceived to be a private or a public body, and if so, how it's held to account. And as Tony Benn used to ask, who put you there and how do we get rid of you?
OK, look, we are in the middle of VE week, really, the way that it's going here. And I can't help but wonder, Pablo, what Winston Churchill would have made, seriously, of the fact that the south coast of England is essentially being invaded as we speak. And this particular organisation that bears his name now apparently supports a vision of a world where everyone is free to move. I am not convinced that Winston Churchill would have allowed the invasion of our south coast from the Channel migrants, would he?
Churchill was the first person to bring up the idea of the United States of Europe. He called for the creation of the Council of Europe to integrate further.
What's that got to do with Eritreans coming across the Channel?
But he supported the sort of globalization and supporting our neighbors, bringing people in if they needed refuge. He was the first person, the greatest prime minister we had, to bring people into our country to say, if you want to come to our country, contribute here, you can seek refuge here if you're being persecuted in your country. That's what he did. That was one of his greatest legacies, that he, during the war, he set a precedent in our country that people looked to the UK and they thought, if I'm struggling, if I'm in a country that's under war, the UK will give me a home as long as I contribute and integrate. Okay. That's what people did, and it has worked. The UK is a perfect example of where integration has worked, and it has benefited us enormously.
It's a perfect example of where integration has worked, has it? Where are you at the moment?
I'm in London.
Oh, are you? So last time I spoke to you, I thought you were in America. I thought it worked so perfectly, you decided to leg it off across the Atlantic. Anyway, look, thank you very much, both of you. We could obviously carry this on, but it's tremendous to have you both on. You take care. All right. I must say, I'm resolutely unconvinced that Winston Churchill would have been pro-open borders. But who do you agree with? Question, would Churchill want his legacy money spent on pro-immigration messaging? Mick, on your say, says,